Welcome to the Daily DLP. I'm your host, Ash Thompson. With the legal tampering period hitting in just 1 week, I'm switching gears for a while, going from the draft and combine coverage to start talking about all the available players the Detroit Lions won't sign in free agency. Today, I'm starting with the interior defensive line. Let's get it on! First, know that I pre-tape these by a day or two, so if someone I mention re-signs, just ignore that part. Pay attention to the skill set. Plug somebody else in. Let's get to the biggest fish in free agency. Christian Wilkins is everything the Detroit Lions could possibly want in an interior defensive lineman. This is a capital D dog for the Miami Dolphins. He played 81% of the snaps for the Dolphins last year and 83% the year prior, and that's in two different defensive systems. He is that versatile, and he is that durable. That's super rare among defensive tackles. Like the Lions, for example, like Benito Jones led the Lions this year at 52%. It would have been Alim McNeill if he hadn't been injured. But guys who play a lot more than that tend to get injured. So when a guy comes along who doesn't, it's kind of rare. Like McNeill missed a few games and came in at 51%, but even without the injury, that's still a 66% clip, well short of the 80s that Wilkins has been putting up. Imagine a world where rather than John Kaminsky, who I very much like and have enjoyed as a Detroit Lion, but imagine instead of him as the 3-tech or 4-eye beside Alim McNeill, imagine that guy is Christian Wilkins. And that's basically the change that you see in the defense. If he came in and did that, like the interior defensive line is suddenly a massive force for this team, as opposed to, frankly, a hole. And a lot of people might be asking right now, like, if you've already got McNeill, why do you need Wilkins? And I come back to an old adage that folks have been throwing around about quarterbacks for like a decade and a half in Detroit at this point. It feels like we're talking about Matthew Stafford and then talking about Jared Goff. Don't let having something good stop you from going and getting something great. And like, here's the thing. Alim McNeill, like for quarterbacks, it's dumb and it gets GMs fired. For defensive tackles, the stakes are a little lower. Alim McNeill is good. He's really good. Like I loved him in his draft year, so when the Lions picked him up, I was ecstatic that they went two defensive tackles I liked in a row. But Christian Wilkins is great. Like, imagine if the Lions had an interior defensive lineman capable of putting up 98 tackles in a season. Those tackles aren't happening 10 yards downfield. Wilkins did that in 2022. Imagine having an interior defensive lineman that was in the top 10 total pressures for the position. Wilkins did that in 2023. But what if he cost us McNeill in a year? Okay, team got better. Just the way it is. It's the price of doing business. Sometimes the guy you drafted isn't the guy who's there 8 years in. That's okay. If the team got better. And again, I'm not hating on McNeill. He's a very good player. But you can play two defensive tackles at once, I'm told, in the NFL. And at this moment, McNeill hasn't done what he would have to do to be as coveted as Wilkins is on the open market right now. Like, if Alim McNeill has the season he just had, he will make 1/3, if that, the money that Christian Wilkins is about to walk into. Again, and there's nothing saying a team can't have two well-paid defensive tackles. Teams do it all the time. The Eagles got to 2 Super Bowls doing it. But that's just my opinion. And the Lions aren't going to do it. This isn't a prediction. This is Ash wishing that the Lions would do the thing, poking them with the stick like the meme. And the reason I say that is because if you look where Dan Campbell was coaching when Ndamukong Suh left Detroit in free agency, and the absolute train wreck that turned out to be, it would be completely understandable if he was a little apprehensive about handing out long, massive deals to free agent players, because that was absolutely calamitous to that franchise, despite the fact that Suh was a good player. The Lions will continue to build through the draft and pick up some guys that enhance the team as opposed to reshaping it through free agency. That's just their MO. That's how they're going to do things. So if we take Wilkins' $30 million per year mega deal off the table, which again, I wish we wouldn't, but let's just assume it's the second tier of interior defenders and below that the Lions are going to look at, who might be left? Because I also don't see Chris Jones or Justin Metabuke being Detroit Lions in a week. Or pick the guy whose name you know. That's probably not the direction they're going to go. Realistically, like, we've watched them go for 2 years. They've had some money. This is not where they spent it, and where they spent it, they kind of still need. Let's just say free agency hasn't worked out super well for the Detroit Lions so far. At least not on the things that they have spent the most money each year on. That hasn't worked out super great to this point. So what kind of guys do I think they're going to go after? Well, let's talk about what the Lions demand from their interior defensive line. It starts with run defense, as in all things for the Detroit Lions. Like, Javon Kinlaw can't stop the run. He's not going to be a Detroit Lion. Quentin Jefferson can't stop the run. He's not going to be a Detroit Lion. You get the idea. All the other situational pass rushers from PFF's top 100 free agent list that you're probably looking at, they're not going to sign any of those guys. Because if you look at what their run grade is and their pass rush grade, it's just not the kind of guy that they're going to sign. And the issue with, like, tier 2 is that they do basically play the same role as McNeil, but they cost $10 million or more. So if you're not really improving over McNeil, there is no reason to make that signing. So like a Sheldon Rankins, he's got ties from the coaching staff from 2020 and before, and that's like a long time ago in NFL years. Like, if they remember each other's names, obviously I'm, exaggerating, but that's 2024. That's an eternity in an NFL career. And he's also happy in Houston, and they have cap space, so that's probably not happening. Like, Leonard Williams is basically a Lee McNeil, but 30. So why would you go pay him a ton as opposed to just having McNeil and waiting a year? It's not a thing where you're drastically improving what you're getting relative to the money that it is going to cost. Like, you can take the probably $18 million difference between those two players, and that's a whole other player at a different position, because those two guys basically line up at the same spot in this defensive scheme, that is. But there is one high-priced interior guy that I would take a serious look at, and that's DJ Reader. Like, he's probably going to get 20 a year unless he takes a discount to stay in Cincinnati. Or unless he takes a discount to stay in Cincinnati. Anyway. Basically, unless he drastically undercuts his own market, he's going to make $20 million a year. But the player that he's taking off the field in Detroit is Benito Jones. And DJ Reader is $19 million better than Benito Jones. And I do not mean that in any way to be offensive to Mr. Jones, because he is a guy who belongs in the league, but he's a guy who belongs in the league making that like $1 to $2 million salary, and that's who he is. But he's a fine example of what that can be. The reason he might be available is because the Bengals have a bunch of guys over the next couple years that they're going to have to pay, and they generally don't pay players once they hit 30. And June 1st is DJ Reader's 30th birthday. He's also coming off a torn quad. So there is a path to availability for a 330-pound wrecking ball in the middle of the defense that just doesn't come around very often. And I'm not, frankly, seeing them in the draft to this same level. So he's a guy who fills a desperate need, and he won't be on the team long enough to interfere with any of the long-term deals that the Lions have to do, and that's a plus here. Like, this guy being 30 years old is actually a positive in free agency for the Detroit Lions, because by the time Jared Goff's actual cap number from the deal that he's going to sign starts like really hitting and kind of biting, this is a guy who either gets cut or just his contract ends before that happens. Same Amon-Ra St. Brown, same deal. You know, like these Penei Sewell, all of the linchpins. And because they play a different position, this doesn't affect Aleem McNeil's potential here. The Lions get flashes of competence from their interior defensive linemen. Like when Isaiah Buggs made a play, that was a beautiful thing. Or when Benito Jones gets the job done. It's a very effective defense. DJ Reader is infinitely better than either of those two guys. And again, I don't mean that as an insult to anybody. It's just a fact. So that's my home run, and that's my triple. That's kind of how I'm laying these out. The home run is Christian Wilkins. The triple is DJ Reader. So he was a solid like double. You know, like you like getting them, but they're not super flashy. You know, like Chuck Knobloch hit a lot of doubles. And you even know his name? So I'm going to go with a guy here that's basically guys who stuff the run in the middle of a defense don't get a ton of press, so you can be forgiven for never having heard of Grover Stewart. He's basically the 30-year-old version of what the Lions hope Broderick Martin will turn into. So bringing him in as an example of how somebody who's that tall and that big can still play with leverage for Martin could be invaluable to the kid. He's still going to get like a low double digits in millions contract on a per year basis. And he is coming off a PED suspension, and that might limit his market. Might get a little bit of a deal because teams are a little put off by that, but he returned from that suspension in week 14, and he could still play. And the thing is, when a guy gets pinched for PEDs, when he comes back, you know he's clean because he's been getting tested constantly. And sometimes those guys drop off a cliff. You could basically, like, there's guys where you can just entirely see how their career went based on which or how often they were being tested as a part of the NFL's anti-doping protocol. Stewart came back and was still a force. Like, he was very, very good. I didn't look up what he was pinched for, but he got along just fine without whatever it was. He's not some like fat plug in the middle of the defense. Like, this is a guy who had a RAS of 7.5 when he was drafted. He's not a pass rusher, but he's not going to be flailing helplessly as a quarterback scrambles by for 18 yards on 3rd and 15 either. That's my double. My single, a guy where I'm like, yeah, cool. You know, got on base. Woo! Daquan Jones. And he's single primarily because of his age. He's 32 years old, so this is not a long-term solution. This is a straight-up, like, 1 or 2 year contract stopgap. But he had more pressures on the quarterback than Aleem McNeil did last season at 330 pounds and 32 years of age. It's probably like a 2-year, $15 million deal, kind of like the Haloti Ngata signing, or trade, I guess, back in the day. both sides sign it knowing like that there's a chance that it's really just a 1 year, $10 million deal with the void year to defer $3 million of the cap hit to the next season. But if Jones maintains his level of play or comes even close, like if he's half that good, if he gets half that many pressures, that would be more than any other interior defensive lineman the Lions currently have got. If he's even half as good, like if the fall off is not so terrible that he no longer belongs in the NFL, he's exactly what the Lions need for however long he can still play beside Aleem McNeil. He's a guy who prevents the quarterback from having an easy, comfortable pocket while he's still holding tough against the run. Like he pushes guards into quarterbacks and makes them move off of their launch point. And that's what you want your nose tackle to do in this defense. All right, I'm going to throw in a bonus guy. Who's my walk? You know, the one that like literally only the Moneyball guys are happy with. Like it's the worst possible thing to watch, but it's like, all right, yeah, fine, okay. I'm going to go with Maurice Hurst. He played for the Browns last year, and remember, I'm not a Michigan slappy, so that has nothing to do with this. He's turned into a solid rotational defensive lineman in the NFL. His athletic profile matches what this team looks for out of a guy. He brings a great blend of agility and power to the table. He graded out in the mid-70s against the run and the pass for the Browns this year, according to PFF, which, like, on guys who don't play very much, that's, I guess he had like 400 snaps or something like that, but it's not one of the guys you're paying attention to. At least I wasn't paying attention to while I was watching Browns games. But he's another reliable guy who can eat some snaps and not be worthless. Like when Aleem McNeil comes off the field, the whole pressure package doesn't collapse if Maurice Hurst is there. That's a good thing to bring on board. Honestly, even if they sign one of these other guys, I would really like it if the Lions would pick up Maurice Hurst. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about running backs, linebackers, tight ends, and quarterbacks. That's 4 short conversations, so I'll run through them like a train running through the San Fernando Valley in a rented mansion. See you then.